Okay, something different today, something a little bit of a twist on it, okay, something a bit interesting. Okay, so I'm down at a job in Essex, and we're looking at this wall. So a lot of these walls were built, it's a very fashionable thing in the late 70s and 80s, you know. These were blocks moulded in a template that was made up. Now, the purpose of these blocks, the ornamental bricks, what we call them, or screening blocks, one was for the look, something different. The craze it went through, a very fashionable craze, was for the look. It looked very different. Two, it had a purpose as well structurally. A lot on the boundary walls, the wind factor could go through, and it obviously take the tension off the weight of the wall. Now, thirdly as well, looking at that, it lets the light through on a very dark shaded area. So north facing, south facing gardens, it would allow the sun to continue and come round with a natural light. This wall also is built out of what we call the LBC heathers, okay, the London Brick Company. Now the heathers is a brick that was mass produced many years ago after the war, because what they done was after the war they wanted to create new towns. So just outside of Essex, they created all these generational new towns where they wanted to populate it and start an industrial sort of revolution, new houses, new schools, new workplaces. Now, these heathers are an old brick to lay for a bricklayer. They're commonly you're picking them up, they chip very easily, the face is chipped, they're not forgiving, but in them days they had to be mass produced to keep up with the surge of the buildings. There were so many built in such a short time, so they were just highly spun on the kilns, high temperature, knocked out at mass, so they could provide the industry with creating these houses. So we have to do a similar like for like. I wanted to indulge and endeavour in who built this wall and understand what was going on at that time. Now, I've spoken to the customer, Bill. He's 81, 82 years old, a very stern old man, but a lovely old man, you know, and he was telling me a guy called Elijah Wright, so we'll call him Mr. Wright, Elijah Wright, okay, built this wall. Now, this wall was built in, he reckons, around about 1980, 1982. So with this wall being built in 1982, it's fascinating because in the early 80s, for those who don't know the young bricklayers, there was a mass recession, okay, a really huge recession that hit the UK really hard. Employment just went through the roof, okay. There was literally no jobs about, inflation went flying high, people were losing their houses. Now, what happened with this in the 1980s recession? There was no work in the UK. Okay, and if there was work, he was very lucky to get this work. Now, people who taught me the trade, I've heard stories about the 1980s where they'd get on the building site, the rates were cut literally 50, 60%, okay? And these guys would do 4 or 5 in a car, share the petrol. They would buy one newspaper between them and share it. I mean, times are really, really hard for these guys in the 1980s. Now, with employment in industry really hard, what did these bricklayers do? You know, you can imagine your mortgage has gone through the roof, you know, there's no work, the rates is work about, it's been cut by half pay. What do? You know, so a lot of bricklayers went overseas to places like Germany, Holland and Belgium and just seeked work. Now these guys used to go over and work long hours, but the money was good, okay, it enabled them to keep alive. Now let's remember this, guys, yes, they went abroad and worked, but they all left their families, you know, a lot didn't see their kids and sent their money home on a weekly basis because it was just too expensive to come back each week and travel. Now, there's a very popular TV series in the 80s called A Vida Sem Pet, which is very realistic about what went on, you know. In them times, it was about working all day. The stress relief for these geezers, I'm going to call them geezers, that's what they was simply go in the pub, have a drink, have a fight and pull a bird. And that's what it was about. But, you know, it was hard times, very hard times for everyone involved. So, with loads of bricklayers, hundreds of thousands flocking abroad to seek work, those who decided to stay because they just simply didn't want to leave their families, decided to work it out and work on the hard pay. What did they do? You know, some just went into residential work to try and get as much work as they thought to themselves, well, if I'm going to earn not good money, reduced rate, I might as well go do little bits around people's houses who could afford to have work done. And many people who were well off financially exploited this, you know, ended up having very big walls down, extensions done for a very lesser rate, but only those who were financially well off. So let's talk about Mr. Elijah Wright, the bricklayer who built this. You know, all those years ago, I spoke to the client, and when he actually built this, he was 63, 64 years old. So early 80s, 63, 64 years old. Can you imagine being a bricklayer? The recession hit, times were hard, and to hit that at that age of life must have had some impact on him, on his personal life. In fact, I would say it probably forced him into retirement, because at 60 years old, would you really want to be going abroad away from the family and putting up with all this financial crisis? I don't think you would. So what we've discovered is he went around this local neighbourhood and he started just doing little bits of jobbing. He probably had his mortgage paid, lucky enough. He probably had a few things sorted. So he just happened to work for a few utility bills and a bit of shopping. So what Mr. Elijah done was he won this wall and built this wall. Now, what was very popular in them days, old school bricklaying, was a lot of guys doing this sort of stuff worked on their own. They didn't have another bricklayer, like a 2-in-1 gang. It was very popular for a bricklayer to turn up and pull in a 20-25 metre stretch of a wall on his own and just take his time, okay? Because back then there was a little less time is money regime. It was more about do your job, is what it is, and get on. Mainly because as a country we wasn't going through the globalisation of what we went through in the mid-80s. Now, what that means is basically the UK was basically the UK. We were very private, working, very, not laid back, but very happy with what we were doing. And it weren't until we become globalised in sort of mid-80s with the MTV, and we wanted to be like America, and America wanted to be like us, and it introduced us to other work ethics. Then times sort of changed, it became about the money. Good, so Mr. Wright's built this wall, and I've spoken to a few neighbours who we've done work on as well. And what I'm getting the gist of is this guy was a quality bricklayer. You know, he was decent. He was very good at what he'd done. So at that time, so I'm going to go over a few things. Now, the wall's still standing, 40, 50 years later, the girl. You know, to be honest, with the materials we use these days, if I build a wall like this, taking the full weather elements, I'd be like happy to say my wall's standing 50 years time. Do you know what I mean? But anyway, so what he's done, he's screen blocked, he's divided the space up. He's put piers in each one to take it, obviously finishing the coping. Now, a couple complaints on here. He hasn't got an expansion joint in there. I would have put an expansion joint in. It's such a big, long row. But at the time, that wasn't evident. It wasn't proven that walls needed these expansion joints. So sometimes we have to question these people who have come up with these inventions. With the inventions of the expansion joints, we have to question it. You know, when we've got evidence that walls are still standing, etc. But my next thing was, he's put 9-inch piers on. In such a long span, I would have put 13-inch piers on. Okay, but I'm not by any means knocking what he's done. Listen, what he's done has worked for this wall. So again, it's put the whole thing up in the air to say yes or no. So I think maybe 13-inch walls on this, 13-inch piers, sorry, on this would have been the way forward and gave the wall a bit of structure. But how much more structure do we want? The wall's 40, 50 years old. So looking close inspection, come look at this. Mr. Wright's even put the reinforcing track in all the bed joints of the screening blocks. Okay. And you notice in his mortar, he's put aggregate to toughen it up. See the little stones? So, this guy, he knew what he was doing. You know, he didn't just throw this wall up, he's done it. That's not done these days because it's time consuming. But it should be done if you work on structural stuff like this and bandy walls. You know, so Mr. Wright, listen, I tip my hat to you. So the overall wall condition has gone, as you can see here, the arch, probably the worst arch I've seen. It is literally twisted, gone. And it just shows you the strength of the arch, the symmetrical side. As it comes in, how the weight is compounding, is actually staying in place. No matter the force of the gravity, the movement of the ground has twisted her, she's still staying in place there. So the strength of the arch is in the curve and the radius. So there's another twist to the wall. You see these blocks? Well, it turns out these weren't just bought down the local garden centre or builder's yard. Mr. Wright and Bill, the owner of the house, who's having the wall done, actually made them themselves by hand. So what they've done was they had a mould made, as you can see, and they actually concreted and made all the blocks there. Now there's two different moulds. You've got the one with the circular radius movement, and you've got the sharp crosses on the front. So this wall has been built by working hands and genius mind, you know. What my job is to do, come here, is we have to try and take all these blocks out because they're a memory, okay, for the owner. He's got a bit of pride, he built the blocks. He wants to save as many as he can. So my job is to take down this wall, save as many of these as we can, and build the wall like for like. The only thing I'm going to try and talk them into is having 13-inch piers, okay, a bit of strength, okay? So that's the task for the next 4 or 5 days. Now, how am I going to get these out? These were moulded strongly, laid correctly. They was only meant to, and made to be laid once. They weren't made to be taken down, you know. So I've pre-warned the client that if we can't save enough to, even if we save a few and we have to change the pattern, it's the character, all these. So I've spoken to the client and I've warned of the dangers. I mean, these blocks were made strongly to last. They wasn't made to last and to be taken down and to be relaid, because the strength around here we're going to lose quite a few. But I have spoke to the client and warned them, look, if we do lose quite a few, there may be a way we can change. Instead of going 5 wide, we may be able to go 4, for example, or 4, 3, 2, 1, put some shapes in. At the very worst case scenario, it's going to be a shame, but if we do lose majority of them, we haven't got enough, I have said we can remake and use the mould, which would be fantastic. I'd love to get involved in that, you know. Imagine with Bill, the 81-year-old, making the moulds again for the bricks. But however, when you're making these moulds, you need a month for them to go off before you actually lay them. And you have to sprinkle them with water every other day, you know, to make sure they dry correctly, otherwise they'll just shatter in the wall. Now, plan C is, if we don't have enough, is we're going to bring the wall up and we're fence pallet in between, because they don't want brickwork all the way up, okay? So it'll be a shame, but we have to be realistic what we're working with here, and realistic with the materials we're working with. Now, the last thing, what concerns me, is there's a budget on this job. So what we're going to do is, see the existing 2 reds that Mr. Wright's put in, we're going to keep, and I'm going to inspect the foundation, and if she's good enough, we're just going to go straight on top of that. Now, I've had to create a waiver for the client to sign, or waive responsibility off, because in my eyes, I would like to do a whole new foundation. But if we inspect it and the first 2 course look okay, with a little bit of a repoint, and the foundation's okay, then we'll go straight on top of her and above. Now, what we intend to do, if you come with me, after a bit of advice, was with the way the houses are at the minute, is with cars per house, I advise to extend the drive. So instead of having a 1-car drive, we're going to take the wall back and we're going to put 2 cars on. So we're going to return the wall a little bit further back, giving the client a bit more car parking space. Putting an easier life on Bill, getting in and out of his car. 2, adding value to the property. Okay, 3, convenience. Okay, so what we're going to do is dig a foundation in there and return this wall in here. If I have time, I'd like to replace the arch, okay? But the money's tight, there's a budget on this job, and to be honest, I'm doing this job because I wanted to do this job, okay? So how am I going to start getting these blocks down? What I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to hose all the blocks down, first of all, just to help give them a little bit of give before we take them down. And then what we're going to do, the bricks will go straight in. The boys Skips, give them a shout out. Sam Skips Clears, it's my boy Skip Company. So they'll all go straight in the skips and then professionally recycled.